Good evening. I'm so glad to have this opportunity to be with Derrick Rogers on this Wednesday evening. And since I would say earlier this year, January, we actually had our first lecture. So Race and Faith decided to start a lecture series, and we kicked it off with a conversation on critical race theory. So we had a conversation. What is it? Why does it matter? Critical race theory, and that was shared with us by Dr. Sharon Chubbuck. And then our next presentation was on radicalization and white supremacy, and that was shared by Pardeep Kalika, the executive director of Interfaith. And tonight we have the opportunity to hear from Reverend Derrick Rogers as he shares about Black male identity. And so, if you're not familiar with Race and Faith is a faith-based organization that simply allows room, if I can say that, for race, when we're having conversations about race, for faith to be a part of that conversation. So often, when there are conversations about racism, we don't allow a lot of room for people to investigate their own belief system and how their belief system is actually helping them to perpetuate racist ideas, or how their belief system could actually help them fight against racial oppression. And so we invite you to enjoy this next 45 minutes or so lecture from Reverend Rogers. And if you are really inspired by what you hear and you check us out on raceandfaith.org and you like what we're doing, please feel free to give a donation. We ask for a suggested donation of at least $20 for this type of experience from the prolific thinkers that we bring before you. And we encourage you to engage this conversation. Please do send your questions in, post them, and if we can get to it on Facebook, we will definitely honor those questions. But please do engage us. Please do engage this information and let us know what you are thinking. And with that, I will turn over this time to Reverend Rogers.
Okay, thank you, Rhonda. Are you able to hear me well enough?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. And first of all, thank you, Rhonda. Just have always appreciated and respected your work. It's good to be in collaboration with you, working in some of these, working on under this banner of this theme of race and faith, something that's near and dear to my heart. Again, Derrick Rogers. I'm a lifelong resident of the city of Milwaukee. Spent almost 30 years as an educator in public schools. Spent a year or two, working with adjudicated youth. Most of my time spent in public school was working with some of our most challenging youth in the public schools, in Milwaukee public schools, and with that, attempting to create spaces and opportunities for youth to receive what I felt was a more holistic education. So I spent a lot of time developing in school and other educational spaces where youth were exposed to culturally responsive education, African-centered education, because majority of my time was spent working with youth of African descent. So a lot of my years in education were done in that area of work. And then I was blessed to spend almost 4 years working in violence prevention, in public health-based violence prevention, which was, just a really incredible experience working with what's known in the city now as violence interruption. So was able to receive some really incredible perspectives around a lot of the things that our youth and young adults, particularly Black youth, males, are dealing with in the city of Milwaukee. So a lot of what I'm going to present today, talk about today, explore today, is based in some of those experiences and is drawn from some of those sources. I've been an ordained minister now for almost 20 years, so the connections between race, urban dynamics, dealing with issues around white supremacy and notions and how that interfaces with the identity development of our youth is somewhere where I'm going with this today. And then I would also like to say, um, uh, we really need to look at, there's a scripture in Lamentations that talks about how, men today bearing, or the youth will one day bear the yoke as men, in their lives. And there's an incredible yoke that our young people are bearing today, particularly Black men. And it's a yoke of complexity. And what I mean by that is the multiple identities that young Black men deal with today, the multiple subcultural elements that make up who they are, is creating one of the most complex individuals that we have ever seen, in the history of this world, I would argue. And so I just want to share. Ron, is the screen able to be seen?
Yes.
Okay. And don't be alarmed by the title.
I'm sorry. No,
It's
I
not.
don't see it.
Okay. All right. We're going to make sure that gets seen. Just give me a second here. We will make sure that that's seen. And here we go. Okay. Should be up now. Okay. We there?
Yes, I can see
Okay.
it.
My apologies. I entitled this presentation on Demon Time. And the reason I use that term is in talking with a lot of young people today, again, youth and young adults, they use that term to describe that mood, that attitude, that disposition that they get in when they're about to do something, when they're about to be on something, as they say, that isn't necessarily the best thing, when they're about to enter into a very aggressive mode, entering into something or taking on a posture that they feel is necessary in that particular instance. And sometimes it can be a quite dangerous posture that they can be in. And a lot of our young people are operating, youth and young adults, particularly Black males, are operating in that space today. And my argument is a lot of it has to do with the complexities of their identity, which is something that we need to take a look at. So because I'm a fan of popular culture and real big in popular culture, I'm just going to start with a few things. These are some characters from the X-Men comic strip. Some of you may be more familiar with them from some of the movies that have come about in the past 10 to 15 years, but this is them from the comic strip form. The X-Men characters, despite what you're looking at here, you're seeing these, what would normally be considered strange looking, even almost monstrosities, all of these different forms, aggressive looks and all of this. These were actually in the X-Men and Marvel Comics, the X-Men were actually youth and young adults. In the Marvel universe of the X-Men, these characters, these mutants as they were referred to, were they were considered very scary. Everybody was afraid of them. They were either fearful of them or they were considered to be heroes because they had these strange gifts and powers that were extremely misunderstood. Extremely powerful, misunderstood. But the thing about it is this: the mutant gene, or this X gene that all of these characters had, was simply a manifestation of the fact that they were highly evolved human beings. They were highly evolved human beings who nobody else understood, and they came across in a manner where it's like, hey, what is this? So an extremely complex individual. When I think about some of our Black males and based on the complexity of their identity, sometimes the X-Men come to mind. And then another piece from popular culture for basketball fans. There was a time some years ago, many moons ago, even when I played basketball, when you were able to look at a basketball player and you were able to say, that particular player plays a particular position. They're a guard, they're a forward, they're a center. Pictured here, we have five of the probably 7 or 8 greatest basketball players in the world. Embiid, Durant, our wonderful Giannis, Steph Curry, and the King, LeBron James. When for those basketball purists, they understand that these individuals, in their multiplicity, in their complexity, in their multiple skill sets, have the ability to play multiple positions. And in basketball today, girls basketball, WNBA, NBA, college men's, this ability to be complex is actually considered advantageous, and it's actually considered to be part of the norm now in our society, in many ways, as is the complexity of Black males living in America. Now, I want to go to this, and this kind of forms the foundation of a lot of what I want to talk about. When we talk about being a man, or if you were to ask a 16-year-old, 18-year-old, 25-year-old to define manhood and what it means to be a man, you'll get a multitude of answers. And a lot of times, if I was doing this in workshop form and I were to ask the question, you would get a lot of different answers. You would hear people say things like, well, I'm a man when I turn 18. Okay. I'm a man when I have a baby, or even when I get somebody pregnant, or maybe even when I first have sex. I'm a man now. How about when I get my own place, when I'm living out on my own? I'm a man. Or I'm a man when I get a job and I'm able to support myself. You'll get many definitions. And the interesting thing about that is this. We have to ask ourselves, when we think about the current definitions of manhood, have they been healthy definitions as we connect the individual to family and community? That's something that we have to look at. There was a time when we're talking about African or Black males, and we look into our heritage, into our history, into our lineage, when manhood was a defined process, meaning somebody let you know when you were a man. It wasn't based on some of those definitions that we just mentioned. You see, with rites of passage, socialization training, when you entered adolescence, the ancients understood that at a particular age, there's this innate desire for symbolic death. Okay. And if you think about it, as I'm saying this, you can tie this to some of the religious symbolisms and mythology and some of the belief systems that we currently embrace. An innate desire for symbolic death, meaning I died as something, I let something go, that's over, and now I'm moving into a new phase. Okay. Also during that time of adolescence, there's this sense of risk and appetite for danger. It's an innate desire. So what the ancients realized and what they understood in these educational systems of the past, and currently even still in many areas of Africa, there was a need for structure and to contain these energies. We have to structure them so that they are directed towards the betterment of community. So they recognized that this shift from boy to man required a significant process. So they created one. Manhood training, or initiation. 3 elements to it. There was separation, there's liminality, and there's reincorporation. Separation was, we're going to take these 12, 13, 14-year-old boys out away from the village. When we take them away, we create, and we take them away with other men who have been through the training and who now represent some of the best of their village and community, and they become the teachers. You separate them, you create a space where there are challenges or liminality. You create a space where the young people are expected to learn all of the elements of what it takes to be a productive person in your family, in your community. We're going to define what those functions are, what it looks like, and how you go about it for, again, the betterment, not just of you as an individual, but of family and community. Challenges are associated with that, trained responsibilities. Once you've gone through this process, whether it be 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months, or even a year in some villages and spaces, now the village will welcome you back. And what they're welcoming back is not the person or thing that left. This reincorporation, what's coming back is a person, a man who is family centered, who is village first, critically thinking problem solvers, self-determined builders, and protectors of their village. Once you've gone through this, now you are a man. Now, here's something that I argue that we have to really take a look at. I argue that one of the issues in our community is that we lack a community sanctioned socialization process that produces men. We leave it up to the schools, or we leave it up to television, or we leave it up to music. We leave it up to all these other spaces. We leave it up to friends, peers, to say, I'm a man now. And then you get those very definitions that I spoke about earlier. And what ends up happening is you end up creating what I call an extended boyhood or extended adolescence, because young males who have not been through that particular process, they can remain a boy forever. A boy in terms of disposition, a boy in terms of lack of responsibility. And then you have to ask, what is the effect of that on community when you've got 30, 40, 50-year-old boys running around? That's something that we have to look at. It has connections to violence. It has connections to many other realms in our community that we consider to be problematic. And I argue that it's the greatest threat to survival of the Black or the African race and of our community. When I talked about the complexity, I kind of sum it up like this. I'm finding that there are 6 different, and I call it Hexa-Cultural, 6 different identity or cultural formations that make up who the young Black male is today. They're operating out of all of these things simultaneously. And that's something we have to really take a look at. I argue that within one Black male, you have an individual who is African in essence. They are American. They are part of the hip hop generation, lifestyle world. They are postmodern, and that has become metamodern, which I'll get a chance to explore, maybe not in this hour, but hopefully the next time I come on. They are post-soul, and they are post-Black, and those are things that I can speak about later. But 6 different identity pieces operating simultaneously, almost to a complexity, almost to the point where, you know how they talk about dissociative identities? Well, this is almost a hypersociative identity piece that's operating amongst a lot of our African or Black males. And it's very complex, and it has a spectrum of not only possibilities, but problematic elements associated with it. Now, at the core of that hexacultural identity piece, you're talking about individuals who, from both a historical and a contemporary sense, are traumatized, made to feel expendable by the American society that they live in, and are reintroduced to a highly politicized, within the past 10 to 15 years, a highly politicized element of their identity, which is something that we have to look at as well. Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome. So we can start there. She talks about fundamentally how living in the DNA of people of African descent is a great deal of trauma, based and dating all the way back and traced all the way back to much of our experience with African enslavement. And those elements live in us today. Some of our attitudes, dispositions, memories, those things still live in us today, and those elements of the trauma of it can have an effect on our values, our decision making, and our behaviors today. So how many different ways are we actually traumatized? Just to stick with that, one of those core elements. There's 4 elements that I like to look at that I want us to explore and take some time to. One of them is dealing with what I call the vampires of consciousness. A second one is what I call our psychocultural community struggle from the aspect of African or African American males. A third would be weaponized schooling, and I'm putting schooling in quotation marks for a reason, which I'll explain. And then what in the past couple of years is what I refer to as the pandemic mutation. Vampires of consciousness. Okay. Beginning with the notion of white supremacy itself, of institutionalized racism, the manifestation of that for the black male in America comes in a multitude of ways. And I've listed, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 here, but there's probably quite a few more. But these are issues that have been spoken of. These are realities that black males deal with on a daily basis. These are at both the individual and the institutional level. These are the things that can sap the consciousness, the ability to see the world for what it really is, the ability to create a positive, self-determined reality when dealing with this multitude of things creates a barrier to that. The vampires of consciousness, what have they done? Well, they fashioned a society where black and ultimately all youth are born into a number of things. They are literally born into it's the air that they breathe. 24/7 consumption is what they're born into, is what their attitude, what their very drive should be based on. They're born to achieve, to accomplish, to perform, to possess, to have stuff, to want more, to use more, to earn more. This is what you do if you're being human, in American society as a youth. That's what the vampires of consciousness tell us. We have to have stuff. If we don't have this stuff, if we're not able to acquire these things, then we begin to question our meaning in life. We begin to question our value. We begin to question our humanhood. We begin to question a number of things about ourselves, which leads to a multitude of issues around our self-concept, self-esteem, self-efficacy, a number of things. So the vampires of consciousness create this. Young people are born into it, and it has an almost exponentially detrimental effect on African American males or youth of African descent because of the multitude, the historical pieces that they're already dealing with around trauma, and then the day-to-day crisis of being black in America. The vampires tell you this as well. They say that any failure is the result of your individual character flaws. It's not societal. It's not the umbrella, institutional umbrella, or just the very fabric of America itself and its failures, but it's your flaws as an individual. As a matter of fact, you may have even been born with this. Whatever your issues are, that comes from you as an individual. That's what the vampires tell us. Then the vampires say this. You live in a democracy. You have freedom, but here's your freedom. You have the freedom of choice amongst consumer products. You got the freedom to buy. That's your freedom. And that's the freedom you should want. That's the freedom that you should value. That's what the vampires tell youth, particularly black youth today. Now, I want to spend a little time here. Because this is where it gets very interesting. The psychocultural community struggle, and I mentioned demon time earlier. When we think about some of the struggles of the African, the black male, adolescent, and young adult, there's a few areas here that I just want us to touch on, but I want to start it with a story. It's been almost a year ago now, because I think it was about 10 months ago. Here in Milwaukee, I was driving. For Milwaukeeans, you'll be familiar with this. I was driving in the area of, I think, was near the intersection of 27th Street and Atkinson Avenue on the north side of Milwaukee. And I was driving on Atkinson, and in that particular driving area, I think the speed limit may be around 35 miles per hour. It definitely isn't over 40. So as I was driving, a car came in the passing lane on the side of me. I was doing about, anywhere between 35, 40 miles an hour. And the car that came past me had to be doing 80 miles an hour, maybe faster. It shocked me. It rocked me. It almost made me lose a little bit of control of my vehicle. And it just kind of, it startled me. I had seen it. It's been something that we've been seeing for years here now in Milwaukee, and it's been increasing. People driving in a quote unquote reckless manner. Anyhow, I was on my way to a service station where I usually pick up one of my favorite drinks, which is really less than a mile further up the road. When I got to that service station, it just so happens that the car that passed me was parked in that station. I recognized it immediately. I went in the service station to get my drink. When I walked in, the young man who I did recognize from the side of his face was just finishing up his purchase. And I said to him, I said, and I was careful, and couched my words. I said, young man, I said, you passed me back there. You look like you were in a hurry. And he said, yeah, school. Yeah, I was moving. And I said, yeah, you're moving pretty fast. And his first words to me were, yeah, but you saw me, didn't you? I said, yeah, I couldn't help but see you. And then he says, and you felt me, didn't you? I paused. I said, yeah, I kind of felt you too. And then he said, and you moved. I said, yeah, I got out of the way, had to. He said, okay. And then he backed his way out of the door and went on. I stood there for a minute and I thought about what that young man was saying to me. Literally, he was saying, I saw him, I felt him, and I moved. Figuratively, and even more so in a spiritual sense, and when we talk about this psychocultural community struggle, I felt like the young man was saying some other things too. That spoke to a number of different things, like powerlessness, invisibility, being deficient of having wins in this society. Powerless in this sense. When he's driving that 1.5 tons of aluminum and steel at 85 miles an hour in a 35 mile per hour zone, in that moment, he has power and he's in control. Okay? He can make things happen in that moment, even if it means somebody moves out of the way. There's a sense of power there. Just like when they're holding that pistol and they're about to make that decision about shooting or taking someone's life. In that moment, there's a sense of power that oftentimes these young Black men, boys, and young adults do not have in other areas of their lives. Feeling powerless, whether that be at the family level or at the society level. There's a sense of power in that moment. Is it misplaced? Is it misguided? Absolutely. But the desire to feel that power is a very real thing. At an existential level, at a spiritual level, is a very real thing. And then he also said, you saw me. I'm visible in this moment. You're going to see me when I fly by you at 80 miles an hour. You're going to see me. I don't always feel visible. I don't always feel that sometimes in my own home with the people who are around me. I don't always feel that in terms of my level of dignity as I move throughout my day-to-day in community. I can feel like I'm a nobody. But when I do certain things, you see me. And then when I speed off and we're at a red light and the light turns green and I'm in my car and I go from 0 to 60 in 5 seconds, I feel a win. I get some victory. I'm kind of victory deficient in a lot of the spaces that I operate in. And that's not a good feeling at the core. That's what I personally feel that what in my conversations with a lot of young people, youth and young adults, in dealing with having been a coach for many years, in my years as an educator, in speaking with people in ministry relationships, the need to get a win. Sometimes there's some deficiencies in that. We're not getting them. The young men aren't getting them. The adolescents aren't getting them. The young adults aren't getting them. And then when you talk about extended adolescence, we're not just talking about 16-year-old boys. You got 30-year-old feeling the same way. Because again, they're operating out of the same value set, out of the same identity set as that 16-year-old. because they're operating from the same definitions of manhood and what they feel the right thing should be for them, you know, in the community that we live in. I want to add to it with this psychocultural community struggle. There's what we also want to call a misguided risk impulse. Okay. Meaning that desire to take a risk is an innate desire. That's a natural developmental piece of adolescence, particularly in boys. Okay. The need to take risks is something they have to do. So driving that car is one way to do it. Stealing that car, stealing that Kia is another way to do it. There was a time, and I have a picture on the screen. You might not be able to see it well, but over there to the left, that second image there is of Johnson Park. Go-kart, giant slide, used to be out here on 76th and Mill Road. And it took me back to my childhood, and I thought about that risk impulse. There used to be more spaces within the Black community or opportunities to have that risk or outlets for that risk impulse. There were ways to do that. I could jump in that go-kart and drive fast and have fun. I could go on that giant slide and feel like do something very scary. I could go to Dandelion Park and the roller coasters and various things. The risk impulse had a direction and I had an outlet for it. But now, what am I going to do? Okay. As a young Black male, I'm going to create opportunities. I'm going to create spaces. I'm going to create a means by which I can have that risk impulse lived out. And sometimes that may be in driving 85 miles an hour in a 40-mile-an-hour zone through a red light. Not necessarily caring about the consequence in that moment because I'm feeling power, I'm being seen, and I'm getting a win. And that becomes more important to be, along with the fact that there's some attention currency in that as well. Because it ain't always about money with the young people anymore either, because attention is the way I get paid, more so than those dollars sometimes. And we see that even in social media and YouTube and Instagram and all of that. But and that's an entirely conversation in itself, but that's something we have to look at. The attention element of it is huge as well. And there are very few outlets based on resources and based on the structure in many of our cities like Milwaukee for those impulses. And then I like to also add that he talked about someone feeling him, okay? You know, drill music, and I'll introduce you to that term. Drill music is a type of music, is a type of hip hop, rap music that came into the forefront somewhere around 2010. So about 12 years ago. And a lot of that music is based on real life experiences, meaning that you have some folks who are and young people who will do some very dangerous things, do some things that were by society standards are unacceptable and oftentimes even heinous, and make music about it. Okay. And that's something that the market for music, the music companies and various things, they literally are pretty much getting rich. And again, the capitalistic elements of that come through the opportunities for these young people to literally create the elements of the music that they're going to write and rap about. And it's very, very dangerous. But again, it's a need to be felt because oftentimes knowing that, first of all, you're putting yourself in a situation where you end up in beefs with other individuals and all this other stuff, it's sometimes worth the risk to live this life for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, because again, people are feeling me and people are seeing me. And that attention is more important than anything else I'm dealing with. I'm willing to take on this very short-lived, microwavable experience in my life just to be able to get some of the things that I want out of life. Okay. So that's and again, that's a topic all in itself that I can't go into a whole lot, but I think it's something that that we're going to need to explore. Excuse me. And then finally, what I like to call homicidal tendencies, which is basically a suicidal ideation based on self-hate. There's an African-centered scholar by the name of Amos Wilson who talked about, when he talked about black on black violence, he talked about a large element of that almost being a form of suicide. Okay, and this is what he means by that, meaning that if a level of self-hatred is so great towards self, feelings about your essence, your history, your culture, your situation, your reality as a black person living in America, oftentimes the thing, and not simply just the person or thing closest to you or living in the greatest proximity to you is the person who ends up being harmed, but oftentimes it's when you see yourself in that other person. When you see the worst of yourself, when you see the things that you don't love about yourself, you have a greater likelihood to do harm to the other. And that's why I refer to it as sometimes homicidal tendencies with a suicidal ideation, because you're killing self. You're basically a form of suicide against yourself when you're willing to drive that car at 85 miles an hour through a red light, or to pull that pistol on someone and pull the trigger. So these are just some elements that I wanted to make sure that we looked at when I talk about that psychocultural community struggle, because all of this, combined with the trauma that we talked about, combined with the fact that society has made young people expendable, again, creates an extremely, extremely complex and troubled individual in society oftentimes. And when it's not trouble, when we are able to have a handle on this, you're still talking about a complexity that still doesn't necessarily receive the level of guidance that it should receive in this society. So it's just one more piece that I want to talk about, and then we can talk about it, or if we have any questions. There's also what I refer to as weaponized schooling. Okay. And being an educator for a long time, this is really central to a lot of the issues that our young people have. And I say it like this, and I was able to glean some of this from a very powerful educator in South Carolina that I refer to as Baba Amin. And he talks about how defective or undereducating our youth, poor schooling in the academic sense, plus miseducation, meaning an education they're receiving that does not speak to knowledge of self, does not speak to historical elements and cultural elements, that is not the type of education that teaches young people to solve the problems of their family, their community, their race, and then ultimately all of humanity. That type of defective education plus miseducation leads to three things: mass failure, misguided intellect, and self-destructive brilliance. Mass failure, meaning academic underachievement, that one is one that stands out. But another element of mass failure is when you have defective and miseducation that creates young people who have absolutely no retention of the best of their culture. The very things that could help them solve their problems, the very things that can help for positive and healthy mental health within young people, psychological strength. Those things are educated out of young people, or things that they are never exposed to. That's a mass failure. Secondly, you can create misguided intellect. Now, here you have on the other end, you can have a young person who's a 4.0 student, and you say, well, he's a success or she's a success. Well, that depends, because if you're creating individuals who their only desire in life is to get a good job, to simply serve the system as it is, to be a part of status quo as it currently is, I got to question whether that's really a successful education. I have to question whether that is truly excellence, especially when you're talking about individuals who have no desire to utilize their skills to build institutions that could serve their communities. So that's something else that we have to look at as well. That's misguided intellect. And then finally, self-destructive brilliance. Developing young people who use all of their talents and artistic gifts and all of these other things, wonderful things that they have, but it's turned into something that's very retrogressive and destructive. That is self-destructive brilliance. And weaponized schooling as opposed to education, which would create problem solvers, critical thinkers, individuals who have a desire to use their abilities to affect community, to solve the problems of their community, to be transformational agents in community. That's what an education would do. But schooling has created these three pieces: mass failure, misguided intellect, and self-destructive brilliance. So I want to stop there. There's quite a bit more that I know we may have an opportunity to explore our next time, possibly next week. But I just want to stop there in case folks had any questions, or Rhonda, if we had any dialogue that we wanted to go into. I am ready for that.
Okay. I am digesting.
Yes, ma'am.
And that was a whole meal. Much more than a two-piece and a biscuit. I can tell you that.
Okay.
Um, so if right now I don't have any questions on coming from social media, but if you would like to um, put a question in the chat box, those of you with us now here on Actual Blue Jeans, that is totally acceptable. If you want to come off mute and come on screen and pose a question to Reverend Rogers at this time, that is acceptable as well. Otherwise, if we don't have any questions, we can conclude this first part of this lecture and prepare to invite people back for part 2.
I know Pastor Terrence Moore has always had a good question. He may come in there. Good man, brilliant man.
It is, you share so much, and sometimes it's good to just sit with it
Mm-hmm.
and think about it and take it all in. And the beautiful thing is we have another opportunity to engage with you on this information. At least I know I do, and I could if I have some questions or something I want to pose. Really, it's more of this conversation and dialogue that I think I could have with you for a whole nother
Absolutely.
a whole nother hour. So yeah, I appreciate the thought you put into this and what you have illuminated for me, and some things that I've been thinking about and conversations that I've been having with various members of my family, including my dad.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I'll leave it right there.
Yeah. And again, this comes from this isn't what's the term that they call it? I can't even think of the term right now. But this is coming from, again, from a lot of experiences and sources. I wouldn't offer this as as prescriptive. This is more just taking a look at who we are, some of the things that we've had to experience, again, based on our reality as African people in America, and particularly adolescents and young adults. And so much of this, again, ties back to faith, because ultimately, I get this old watch to stop. I'm gonna throw it in a minute. because ultimately the there's going to be there's a spiritual component to all of this and a spiritual foundation to all of it. And actually we're going to talk a little bit about that, hopefully next time as well. Because when we talk about under that whole postmodern element that we've been under for many years now, there's an entire spiritual and a religious sensibility to that as well that we have to look at, and some of the divergent pieces that have come out of that, some of the ways that looking at faith, looking at God talk, as we call it, so and expressions of spirituality. So there's a lot of things that tie back to a lot of these things that I've talked about today, everything from education to this whole psychocultural struggle. So yeah, hopefully we get a chance to talk about that. But again, I've heard people say that it makes them think of things that they encounter with family, with young men, boys, children, things they dealt with in school, at church. And that's exactly what I want to do, is drum up that type of dialogue. Because what we often find is once people understand, because people say, oh, we done heard all the problems all the time, we know the problems. I don't think we always truly know and understand what the problem
No,
really is, or what's at
we've
the
heard all the
essence.
symptoms of the
Yes,
problem, but we ain't
absolutely.
really got to the point of really
Hmm.
assessing and diagnosing what it is. And I think that this is an attempt at really some diagnostic work and
Absolutely.
trying to do that kind of assessment to say, okay, we see these things happen, these symptoms.
Hmm.
So what is the root of this?
Yes.
Um, and trying to find that. And then, I don't know if you're prescribing any answers next week or if this just
Yeah, we could.
continued
Yeah.
ongoing, just more prompt and more conversation, which I think in some ways that's fine too, especially with this type of information and what you presented for us to, and those who watch it now or may watch it later, to continue to sit with it, think about it. If you are a spiritual person and you do pray, maybe some prayers or other type of ritualistic ways people use to try to make sense of, heal, move on, and find an answer.
Absolutely.
Um, Maybe then collectively we can find other ways to come together and put together some answers. Obviously, it's not a one size. It won't be a one
Right.
size fit all kind of approach. I think what's stuck with me and what I'm thinking about, or maybe what I consider as a validation for a thought that I've had, is that long range you had. So I was really interested in hearing you talk about extended adolescent period
Hmm.
being so extended, and using 20 to 60 as
Yeah.
that long. And I'm just like, he ain't lying.
Yeah. Isn't that huge? And that's problematic
It is
in
probably
so many
very
ways.
problematic, but it has to be labeled and put out there and said,
Yes.
um, in a way that I don't think is demeaning.
That's right.
I didn't, it's saying like this is what we see and know and feel, and for me, like I'm saying, is a validation because I feel like, okay, um, I'm still seeing certain things
Hmm.
and experiencing certain things, and I'm thinking like, you know, we should be further along. Um,
Yes. And
it's
see,
saying to
Rhonda.
me, this is
Yeah.
thinking about black men. Like I would be, especially I'm a single black woman and I'm heterosexual, so I would prefer to date a black man. But my dad, he always like, you just need to go get you an old man. I'm like, Dad, like, sorry to bust your bubble, but I met 50 plus 60. That's me, and I'm like, he's still growing up.
Yeah, and I think the more transparent we're willing to be about that, and as men, um, not viewing it as like as you said earlier, an attack, but to just talk more about being a work in progress. Because if we recognize that fundamentally that definition of manhood that we need to trace it back to accountability, responsibility, caring about family, community, wanting to be problem solvers, then we need to look at all of those elements and say, okay, how far are we moving towards the manhood piece? I'll let you still call yourself a man. I'm still going to call myself a man, okay? But if we internalize and at the spiritual level and at the cultural level say, okay, but we don't always want to see ourselves as some finished product because considering the forces that we're dealing with and considering the hole that we're in, we ain't got to say it outwardly, but on the inside, let's just say we ain't quite there yet. We still manning up, okay, in many ways. And then we'll know that we're there when these conditions have changed.
Yeah.
When our communities are stronger, when there is a more self-determined empowered base amongst African American people, then we'll know if we're manning up really to that point. So that's just something that's not, and to be honest, that's not something I talk about in public very often, especially in mixed company, for lack of a better term. But that's just a reality that I'm going to stand on.
You know, just hearing you say that brought to my mind the phrase that's been shared quite often: loving our sons, raising our daughters.
Hmm?
How do you think this plays into what you have shared tonight?
It's extremely problematic because um, unfortunately, it seems that many of our mothers operate from that same definition, not understanding how sometimes in their understanding of love towards their boy, their child, their male child, that some of the ways that they're socializing that young man, some of the things that they allow, or some of the things that they expose them to, or some of the ways that they quote unquote rear them can be moving them further along the spectrum of extended adolescence because they're not understanding that there's a marker there, there's a time there where certain things need to begin to occur, certain exposure, certain understanding, certain ways of explaining the realities of the world, and helping them to accept what their responsibility is moving forward. If there's a level of hand holding but beyond what it should be, okay, loving your sons, which ultimately oftentimes ends up being a little too much of extended hand holding. And don't get me wrong, sometimes it's done out of fear because many mothers understand and recognize how dangerous, America is. And in loving their boys, they're trying to protect them as well.
Right.
But we just have to have a conversation about what proper socialization really looks like.
I think that's, I don't, this is, maybe you can take this as pushback or not. I don't see it as pushback, but just extending it. I see that happening between when fathers are parenting too.
Mm-hmm.
Which is part of the conversations that I, had with my dad and I've had with my uncles about, you know, our men in our family who grew up in a two-parent home. For the most part, most of them did. Most of them don't have the story that people like to say of, I was raised by a single mom. I don't know who my dad is. That one narrative. That wasn't the narrative for many people in my family.
Right.
However, the results are the same. Um, and so I think that's why I was so fascinated with your presentation, because I think it started just opening up that, just really expanding on that extended adolescence piece. And then the chart you had with the 6 areas of that pie chart you put up. So I look forward to hearing more about other aspects of that as we move forward, because I think it's a collective thing, not just moms, but it's ways I think dads do that too, that
Mm-hmm.
we may not always see or pay attention to, and maybe it might be coming out of their space of still being in that extended adolescence
Absolutely. That's
themselves and not being able to really see it or recognize it or know it.
mhm.
Um, but it's
That's
really like,
probably even more problematic. Yeah, and because you had just mentioned being a single mom, that's why I emphasized the female aspect of it as a mother. But the other side of it is if we got boys raising boys, that's problematic, and we have to be very careful. But again, it's it's again because this false socialization and this poor definition of manhood, we're talking about generations of this now. But then especially since we've been divorced from some of our other roots, which I'm going to talk about later too, in this post soul era and no longer be collected to certain religious sensibilities and many things that came out of the South that at one point we carried forth, into the North, which we are now almost two generations removed from, and a lot of those folks are almost no longer with us anymore. So we don't even carry some of those values that traced a little bit closer to some of those African definitions of manhood, but it's
mm,
leaving us now. How do we retain that? How do we move that forward? How do we grasp that legacy before it's gone and appropriate it and move it forward in a healthy manner for our community?
yeah. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate this time, this conversation, this opportunity to learn from you, this labor of love that I know it is that
Hmm.
you're putting forth. And if you are watching this, if you watch it recorded later, however you come across this information, when you do come across this information, please do consider providing a donation towards Race and Faith. Our goal is to continue to bring forth these types of conversations and learning opportunities to not make you think what we think or what the presenter is thinking, but to get us all thinking deeper, um, engaging information in a way that we may not have been exposed to or allowed to engage it before. And really, we want to move towards being in a space that is more welcoming and whole and honoring of all of our collective humanity. And so we need to do what we can do to rid ourselves of racism and all the various ways it shows up. And so if you want to continue um, receiving these types of conversations and materials, please do consider giving a donation to Race and Faith. You can go to raceandfaith.org and leave a donation there. Um, if you would like to reach out, you can send comments there on our page. It's a space for you to contact us, or you can email me at Rhonda, RHONDA, at raceandfaith.org. So good night, and remember to join us next week, Wednesday night, again, 6 p.m. And Reverend Rogers will wrap up this lecture on Black male identity.
Thank you.
Thank you.